Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has not only redrawn front lines on the battlefield but has also completed a profound internal transformation of the Russian state. What appears, at first glance, as a paradox, the growth in the number of Russian billionaires amid war and sanctions, reveals, on closer inspection, a decisive consolidation of political power and economic control under the Kremlin. Wealth in contemporary Russia no longer functions as an independent source of influence. Instead, it has been subordinated to the imperatives of war, regime survival, and geopolitical confrontation with the West. The silencing of oligarchs is not a byproduct of the conflict but one of its enabling conditions. Over the past quarter-century, Vladimir Putin has methodically dismantled the post-Soviet bargain that once allowed oligarchs to convert economic capital into political leverage. The war against Ukraine accelerated this process to its logical endpoint. Fear of repression, the weaponization of sanctions, and selective access to state-facilitated opportunities have combined to produce a class of ultra-wealthy actors who are richer on paper yet poorer in autonomy. Their dependence on the Kremlin has become structural, locking them into the war economy even as that same war undermines Russia's long-term growth prospects. This internal realignment matters far beyond Russia's borders. The Kremlin's ability to sustain a prolonged, resource-intensive war rests not only on military-industrial output and manpower but also on the political obedience of economic elites who now function as extensions of state power. At the same time, the erosion of independent centers of influence removes potential internal constraints on strategic decision-making, increasing the risk of miscalculation abroad. Understanding how Russia's oligarchs were neutralized and repurposed offers critical insight into the durability of Putin's war strategy, the resilience and fragility of Russia's economy, and the broader geopolitical consequences of a system where power is centralized, insulated from dissent, and increasingly divorced from economic reality. The war in Ukraine has functioned as a stress test for Russia's political economy, exposing how deeply the country's military ambitions depend on the subordination of its economic elites. On the first day of the invasion, the image of dozens of billionaires summoned to the Kremlin, silent, tense, and visibly uncertain, captured a pivotal moment. This was not a consultation but a signal. Strategic decisions had already been made, and the role of the oligarchs was to comply. From that point onward, loyalty became less a matter of ideology than of survival. Those who resisted, even rhetorically, faced rapid expropriation, forced sales, or exile, as illustrated by the case of Oleg Tinkov. His loss was not merely personal, it was a message to the entire business class that political deviation would be punished through economic annihilation. Western sanctions, often expected to fracture elite cohesion, instead reinforced this dynamic. By trapping capital inside Russia and restricting oligarchs' access to global financial systems, sanctions reduced their exit options and increased their reliance on the state for protection and profitability. In effect, the Kremlin transformed external pressure into an internal disciplining mechanism. Deprived of international mobility, many oligarchs recalibrated their interests to align with the regime, becoming stakeholders in a war economy that rewarded compliance with access to newly available assets. The departure of Western companies created a redistribution of wealth that favored Kremlin-aligned businessmen, generating a new cohort of loyalists whose fortunes are inseparable from Russia's confrontation with the West. This transformation has direct implications for the war effort itself. Russia's military-industrial complex increasingly relies on domestically controlled capital, informal networks, and state-directed investment to sustain production under sanctions. Oligarchs, once oriented toward global markets, now act as financiers, intermediaries, and managers of a militarized economy operating under conditions of scarcity and opacity. However, this system carries inherent weaknesses. Asset acquisition based on political loyalty rather than efficiency undermines productivity, while the absence of competition and transparency encourages corruption and misallocation of resources. These distortions are already visible in declining industrial output, shrinking production in key sectors, and an economy that is being kept afloat through administrative control rather than organic growth. The contradiction at the heart of Russia's wartime model is increasingly stark. The Kremlin projects an image of stability, low unemployment, a resilient ruble, and strategic self-sufficiency, yet beneath this narrative lies a fragile equilibrium. A strengthening currency, driven by capital controls and high interest rates, erodes export competitiveness and constrains industrial recovery. Meanwhile, the fiscal burden of war continues to rise, diverting resources from civilian sectors and deepening structural imbalances. The silencing of oligarchs removes a potential source of internal critique that might otherwise warn of these risks. In doing so, the regime gains short-term cohesion at the expense of long-term adaptability, locking itself into a path where strategic persistence in Ukraine becomes increasingly costly but politically unavoidable. The subjugation of Russia's oligarchs completes the architecture of a wartime state built on centralized authority, constrained choice, and managed loyalty. In the short to medium term, this system enhances the Kremlin's capacity to endure. With economic elites politically neutralized and financially trapped, the likelihood of internal pressure forcing a policy reversal on Ukraine remains low. The war can be prolonged not because it is economically rational, but because the mechanisms that might normally impose rational limits, elite dissent, market discipline, and institutional transparency, have been systematically dismantled. This helps explain why mounting industrial decline, falling household incomes, and warning signs of stagflation have not translated into meaningful strategic adjustment. Yet endurance should not be confused with strength. The very success of Putin's elite control strategy amplifies Russia's long-term vulnerabilities. By eliminating pluralism within the ruling class, the system concentrates decision-making in a narrow circle, increasing the risk of strategic blind spots and policy inertia. Economic actors who owe their wealth to political favor rather than performance have little incentive to innovate or reform, leaving the state dependent on coercion and administrative fixes to manage complex economic challenges. As the war grinds on and sanctions deepen, this model becomes progressively less sustainable, even if it remains politically stable. At the regional and global levels, the implications are significant. A Russia insulated from internal dissent is more likely to pursue confrontational policies abroad, calculating that time and fatigue will weaken Western unity before domestic pressures become unmanageable. At the same time, the hollowing out of Russia's economic foundations limits its ability to translate military persistence into strategic success. For Ukraine and its partners, this creates a paradoxical landscape, a Russian state capable of fighting longer than expected, yet increasingly constrained by structural decay. In the longer term, the outcome of the war may hinge less on battlefield breakthroughs than on whether Russia's over-centralized system can adapt to cumulative economic strain without the corrective feedback mechanisms it has deliberately silenced.